Hey everyone, so Lehman Kessler here. We are having ourselves a little bit of technical difficulty as far as trying to get our guest David Nickle online, and we are, as you can probably tell if you've been falling behind, we're dealing with just a little bit of a delay, but we are going to just jump right ahead and hope that he can join in because David is a phenomenal writer, a phenomenal journalist, and I really hope that you all get a chance to hear him speak. And we will make sure that everything works. If I'm seeming a touch distracted, it's because I am trying to work everything out with him. But I wanted to make sure you all didn't wander off, that we had you guys still here. And I'll, you know, be talking and be telling you a little bit about David, about some of his background, and hopefully he'll be able to come on and he'll be able to talk about his work himself. So I'll get things started off. David and I got to know each other a little well because we both lived in Toronto, and we ran in not quite similar circles, but we were able to get to know each other just because the Toronto horror world is not the largest. And after we were sort of, I think, seeing each other online in various sort of horror worlds, Lovecraft worlds, and we actually had the opportunity to meet in person at Necronomicon, and then realized, oh, we're both in Toronto. We should try to meet up in person more often. Hello, Clayton. Welcome, welcome aboard. As I've mentioned, we're still dealing with a little bit of technical issues, trying to get our friend David Nickle on the show. I'm going to be trying to make sure. Here we go. I think we might be getting there. We're trying to get him on here, but Google Hangouts can be a little persnickety at times for folks who are unfamiliar with the platform. Maybe it's a Canada thing. Our last main technical issues we had were with poor Sylvia out in BC. So maybe for whatever reason, there is some sort of border issue. I'm going to blame the current administration because that's what I do, and I see no reason why I shouldn't. So that's how I roll. And we're right now, if you're joining us, we're talking about David Nickle, talking about some of the work he's done. I guess speaking of cross-border issues and politics and whatnot, aside from writing horror, David's main beat is working as a journalist and a reporter on the City Hall beat in Toronto, a beat that was incredibly lively during the notorious Rob Ford years. And is getting livelier still now that Rob Ford's brother Doug Ford is the premier of Ontario, the equivalent of a governor. And it's so I think David's got some pretty decent job security there. At least as far as having strange and curious things to write about and talk about. But he also writes some incredibly stellar fiction. And that's the reason why we wanted to have him on the show tonight. The reason we wanted to talk about him is the work that he's done and the writing that he's done. And not just fiction, but he's also written and talked a lot about Lovecraft himself. And if we're very lucky, we will get him on board to talk about that. If you're unlucky, I'll have to talk about what he said about Lovecraft, which no one wants. So let's hope, against hope, that we have him here and able to give us some of his thoughts. It is always frustrating fighting with technology, but that's, we go to internet with the internet we have, not with the internet that you want. And here he is. So I'll deal with questions and concerns from the audience while we're waiting for David. In saying that the live streams don't show up on the YouTube channel or subscription notifications because they're listed as unlisted. Well, that's true. I have them as unlisted until Saturday. So I leave them up, and then Saturday I swap them over. And that should send out notifications. I know that because the time I shifted all of the fungi from Yuggoth from unlisted to public. They exploded and spammed everyone's emails. So I would have assumed that these ones do. I wonder if there's something different with the live stream. Anyway, I also, on Saturdays, I try to make sure I send it out on the Facebook page, on Twitter, on Tumblr. I try to get it out to as many folks as I can. And the views seem to be similar to the views that we get for our regular shows. Um, it's yeah. So I don't know. It might be just a weird issue with the subscriptions, but either way, folks are watching, which is good because well, at least when we have guests, it's a good thing for folks to get a chance to see, and I hope to share a lot of these fine people who have a decent amount of talent. The two books in particular I want to talk tonight about, regardless of whether David is here, are they're in a series. There's Utopia, and there is Volk. Utopia came out a couple of years ago, and Volk is fairly recent. And they are both really fascinating explorations of eugenics and eugenic thought, and looking at the juxtaposition of historical racial history and sort of racial hygiene policies, which were obviously something that Lovecraft dealt with in a very different way. But David juxtaposes the kind of the horror, the Lovecraftian horror, sort of strange entities and things that are a bit beyond mortal kin, with the very real, very disturbing horror of racial eugenic science. And they are chilling. They are absolutely terrifying stories. And the first book in particular, Utopia, was one that absolutely gripped me. There's a lot of body horror in it. There's a lot of like surgical horror, medical horror, and since it takes place in the early 20th century, it's not particularly ideal surgical conditions, which allows him to really explore and play with the space in an interesting way. One of the main characters in Utopia, in the first book, is a black doctor, and looking at someone who's educated, who's strived to really make a name for himself and to fight against a lot of odds, going into a very Lovecraftian world, in multiple senses of what that means. It's a really thrilling and terrifying story. And Volk is sort of a direct sequel. It takes place decades later, in the 30s, and is looking at, as you might have guessed from the title, Volk is dealing with kind of the rise of Nazi eugenic science and policies, and has some sort of carryover of some of the characters and a lot of the concepts from the first book. But it wasn't his books that first introduced me to David. I think the first thing I read of his, I'm going to share it in the link, was an essay he wrote on his website back in August of 2014. Here we go. I'm putting this into the link. And it was about his experiences trying to talk about Lovecraft and racism, something that we deal with and talk about here on the show, and trying to go and have frank conversations in on panels at cons, and running up against a lot of discomfort, a lot of folks who were not interested in being part of that conversation, and yeah, and so this was 2000. What particular fight was going on in 2014? I think the World Fantasy Awards stuff was starting to really get heated, and we had dealt with other issues. There's always something, right? Every for a while, it felt like every few months in the world of Lovecraftian fandom, we were having some dispute over how we talk about Lovecraft and race. But he just had a really unsurprising for a journalist and someone who writes very well about race. He had a really thoughtful sort of way of discussing it and talking about the importance of it, and like myself, I think he, ascribes to the fact that this is something that has to be discussed. It doesn't mean it has to be dwelled on constantly. It doesn't have to be, constantly sort of, harped on and be the focus of all of our attention, but it can't be too far from our conversations. And I appreciated that, and I appreciated his kind of willingness to put himself out there. And I think he got a little bit of flack for it, but ultimately it was a really fantastic, read, and I'm happy he wrote it because people are willing to listen to him more than they are to me. So let's see what's going on over in the chat. Like I said, we're still waiting for David. He may be doing some rebooting and whatnot. So we've got Clayton. Yes, hello. Crashmanster. Oh, who's the one concerned about the? Oh, okay. So this is Elon. Talking about wanting to keep the membership and everything visible. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. As folks know, the whole part of the raison d'etre of this whole show was to do a bit more engagement, fan engagement, community engagement. The kind of stuff I wanted to see happen over at Patreon. I was like, okay, these are folks who are willing to invest money as well as time into my show, so they should be able to have access to and be willing to kind of engage in sort of community engagement. But Patreon's whole sort of foundation just I wasn't working for me as far as that goes. I still very much appreciate your donations, and if you wish to become a donor, go to patreon.com/asklovecraft. But I wasn't able to. I was finding that it just there wasn't that same level of engagement. There wasn't that same level of folks sort of tuning in. I was posting videos, I was posting exclusive content, and part of it is it's a small crowd. It's it's a very nice, intimate selection of people for whom I'm very grateful. But it just because of how sort of Patreon is set up, it's not really a social platform, right? It's a place folks can kind of go and check things out and sign up to help, but it's not, doesn't have that same kind of give and take, or at least I wasn't able to master that same give and take. And so when I started up the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society Facebook group, there, Facebook is all about maintaining connections and getting people to pay attention and to be keyed in and to have all sorts of terrible disinformation campaigns played upon them. But I'm like, well, why can't I have a disinformation campaign? Why can't I, be the Russian propaganda bot you want to see in the world? And so my idea was to make this sort of, again, semi-exclusive, to make these chat shows something that, folks who are invested in the program, at least enough to join a Facebook group, make it a place where they could come and have a conversation, which has been the most successful part of the whole endeavor, right? I mean, the art that people have shared, the music people have shared. I've gotten to know you all in a really, really nice, fun way. And so when I did the live show, I wanted that to be exclusive. I wanted that to be something that I share first off with you all, and then after a few days, not long, then I share it to the wider world. And that allows my guests to be able to share it on their various platforms and whatnot. But I want a few days just to percolate, just for those of you who tune in right now, and for those of you who are part of the society, to feel like you have something in. So David is in, can't seem to give Hangouts permission to use his camera and microphone. Please give permission. Why not? Why? Oh dear. Yes, he's definitely having all sorts of issues with his installer. So if anyone out there knows how to help poor David, please let us know so we can have him on before the before the show is over, which hopefully won't happen. Because that would be a major bummer. Let's see. We have some other things having on. If a movie was made, it would have to be someone who was inspired by David Cronenberg or the makers of From Beyond. That would be great for physical makeup effects to come back. Oh, if you're talking about Utopia and Volk, yeah, I don't really know. His stuff. His stuff is really fascinating. I don't know if it's quite Cronenberg levels of just gooey KY jellied up, just sort of rubber, all over the place. I mean, that's certainly very evocative. I mean, what David does was very well is kind of uh, capture that specific moment in American history, um, and a specific voice. You know, that kind of idea of, progress and modernity, and we are going to, push forward and make the modern man, uh, which, as we know from history, led to some really horrible abuses and nightmarish situations, which I think is, yeah, and I think it's a fascinating way to play with horror, without it, sort of beating you over the head with like racism is bad. Like, you could just see what the impact of that sort of line of thought was, how it scarred our world, all these sort of attempts at social hygiene. Um, and and it's not something that's exclusive to the Third Reich. It's not something that's exclusive to America. I mean, Canada, uh, like the quiet neighbor who you never hear anything from, but perhaps has a attic upstairs with a couple of heads and duffel bags. Canada's has gotten up to some weird stuff in the past, and they tend to get a bit of a pass because people aren't paying that much attention to them. Canada had eugenics laws on the books for a while. I want to say the last person to be sterilized because of eugenics laws was as late as the 1970s. Someone who was in an institution and they were worried that her Catholicism would, lead to lurid, licentious behavior being passed on to children. Like, really creepy, awful stuff. And of course, Canada has its really sort of nightmarish history with Indigenous people, with First Nations. Being a European settler country, the big element that's sort of being reckoned with and is still being reckoned with is the residential school system. This is something that there was a lot of conversation about while I was living in Canada, and I saw very up close because the church was involved. Various churches were involved. Anglican Church. Oh, there we go. I saw.
Aha, here we are.
You showed up just as I'm talking about residential schools.
Are you talking? Oh, marvelous.
All right. Well, we'll talk. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to talking about the horrible offenses against humanity that Canada has committed. So,
yeah.
Everyone,
Yeah.
welcome to the show,
Hello.
David Nickle. I've given everyone sort of a brief synopsis of your CV and how and of Utopia and Volk. I figured I would sort of share the good word of that, if nothing else.
Look at them. Look what you have.
I know, right? I got the really nice edition of Utopia that has the all the fancy signatures and whatnot. So
yes,
I'm all about supporting my local authors, which actually I want to say, I mentioned how I discovered your blog post about let me see if I can find the great title you had. We mustn't mention the war. Thoughts on Lovecraft and race. But I was familiar with your work because I worked at a bookstore in Canada, and you were either on a staff pick wall or a local author wall with Rasputin's Bastards.
Oh wow, okay. That takes me back.
Because when did that come out?
That would have been, I think, around 2012.
Okay. And was that also with
2012, 2013?
Was that also with Chai Series, Chai-Zine Press?
Yeah, it was with Chai-Zine. It was. That's okay. It's an American thing, like bathroom, washroom.
Milk and bags and other abominations.
Milk and bags and other things. Yeah, that was with Chai-Zine. That was actually the funny story with that book. I'd actually written that book long before I'd written Utopia.
Okay.
But Rasputin's Bastards is quite large.
Yes.
Really unwieldy large. Some may say altogether too large. And certainly my agent at the time, when I tried to ship it to him, did. So I did what any writer does. I gave up and drank for a while, and then figured I'd better write a new book. Yeah. I better write a new book. So I came up with Utopia. That Cheesine bought that, and it did well enough that they had looked at an earlier draft of Rasputin's Bastards that I had shortened at the request of this agent, and it wasn't any good, and they didn't buy it. But they thought, this one's doing well, so why don't we look at the terrible book anyway, and see if it's going to be better? And I said, well, as long as you're looking at it, I have the good one. And I thought it was a delicate moment because Utopia had done just well enough that I could maybe sell a 185,000 word novel, and I did.
There we go.
That was the trick. So they read it and thought that was much better. So maybe I should have shown that to them for the first time. Except, of course, there's no way they'd publish 185,000 word first novel. So
now I knew a fair amount about Cheesine just because I had I lived in Toronto and was friends with folks like Helen Marshall and. Was Cheesine mostly Toronto-based authors, or was it just that I happened to have that sort of small, sort of select group of folks that I was seeing being published by them?
I think there were a lot of Toronto-based authors initially, because one of the things when Brett Savory and Sandra Kasturi turned their website, Cheesine, into a publishing house, one of the things they really wanted to do was publish their friends. They knew that they knew a lot of writers in Toronto, some of whom were doing kind of weird esoteric stuff that was tougher to market in a large commercial press. I thought we'd like to publish them, so they initially went out to people that they knew, people that were local. They said there's a huge speculative fiction scene in Toronto, so no shortage of good writers. But since then, they have expanded to publish authors from all over the world.
Great,
and they have probably 100 books out by now.
Well, yeah, I definitely feel like I'm seeing them sort of expand more and more, but I wasn't sure what sort of the initial thing. So that's fascinating because I don't think I wasn't aware of them until I was seeing sort of books and the Cheese series. That's really when I got to know about them, was the Cheese series. Have you been much involved with that?
That's a huge thing that they started in Toronto. It's often when speculative fiction writers get together, they get together at science fiction conventions or fantasy conventions, and there is that long weekend long kind of mode of engagement. You've really got to be committed. The nice thing with the Cheese series is it's a monthly reading series at the same bar every time, at a nice transit accessible downtown bar. Just a few hours once a month. You see everybody. It really maintains a level of community that I think the convention circuit can't quite match unless you've got an awful lot of money to go to an awful lot of conventions. Or just have a credit card.
That's right. An expense account,
An expense account, yeah.
So you managed to. So we had the. So I'm trying to work out the chronology of your writing work. So you wrote Rasputin's Bastards, then you wrote Utopia. But I'm like, why did you decide to write about ethnic hygiene and kind of communes as kind of one of your big forays into?
Well, I'd actually been reading a book called War and the Weak by Edwin Black. It might be back here somewhere. I should have had it handy. It's a huge comprehensive history of the eugenics movement. One of the things that I actually bought it because one of the things I used to do was go to the world's biggest bookstore in Toronto when I was at loose ends looking for story ideas and just walk through the nonfiction section, see what people were reading. And I had a look at this and I thought, man, there's a terrible story in this, and like terrible in the best sense of the word. There were as I went through it, I realized I saw that in the early 20th century, late 19th century, the eugenicists were coming up with really what turned out to be one of the great evils of the 20th century and possibly the human race, the Holocaust, in what they must have imagined was a utopian and really, really optimistic and benevolent light. And I was fascinated with the idea of good intentions turning into such yawning evil.
Well, before you showed up, I was talking about, the kind of that sinister optimism of, modernity, right? We are going to craft the modern man, craft the modern society.
Yeah.
And you know, we got some good things out of it. I guess we got like, you know, highways and stuff like that. But um, but yeah, the eugenics movement, and again, it had such a lingering effect. I was telling the audience about how, you know, Canada, you know, was still sterilizing people up until the 70s, right? I think the last reported case
Yeah,
was a woman in the 1970s.
that's right. And a great deal of that happened in Alberta, and it had to do with sterilizing people who had developmental issues,
Yeah.
who were what you would have called in the day mentally retarded, and it it says something about in the day you would use that term, and you would also sterilize people. Uh, it's one of the things I think that in a lot of ways we have only recently come to a kind of respect for human life, and for human and for just human beings in a
Right.
more universal way.
Well,
And
we're getting there.
I'm afraid it's fleeting.
Well,
I'm
there.
afraid
Okay, yes, that's
what's
very.
happening. But
That's that definitely is a fear I think we see, um, uh, because yeah, I mean, and it's interesting seeing the juxtaposition. You know, Utopia is, you know, glibly sort of, you know, a horror story set at the, you know, road to Wellville. Um,
yeah,
you know, it's this very intense sort of, you know, kind of laser focus, and then Volk kind of pulls back and inserts itself into the kind of the more infamous, you know, eugenics and social experiments and nightmares of the Third Reich.
mm-hmm.
Transitioning, you know, was it a pretty straightforward transition from one to the other? You're sort of like, all right, where does eugenics takes us next? Or, you know, were you kind of consciously looking for something that would have uh, more kind of cultural awareness and resonance to tap into?
I think it took me a long time to decide to write a sequel to Utopia. When I wrote it, I thought of it as a standalone novel. And what in as I was as I was casting about, there were some choices I could make. I could have written another novel set roughly in the same period, that would simply have carried on the immediate events of that first novel. That would involve admitting that I ended that first novel very badly, and and what I wanted to do was I wanted to, with Volk, I wanted to take the ideas that I'd kind of seeded and take them to their conclusion. To my mind, like it's very true that the eugenics movement didn't see its conclusion in the Second World War and the Holocaust, as much as we wish it would be so. But it was a height. It was a point where a culture was starting to very openly embrace these ideas, which were controversial, in most of the world. Um, with that said, when I wrote Volk, I didn't take it quite to the Third Reich. The novel takes place in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, before
Oh,
the
that's
quite
true.
come to power. But it very much addresses the ideas that, that would take us to the nightmare of the Third Reich,
Well,
and in a way tries to preempt it in a way,
oh, go on.
uh, to just engage with the ideas as they're coming up, rather than when they're solidified. I found as I was writing it, I had no interest in actually writing about the Third Reich. That's a period that has been well plumbed, and it's a period where these ideas are actually set. What I was interested in was that point where where the notions of racial superiority, of eugenics, and of the national Volkish notion that had driven the Nazis was starting to coalesce. Because at
Well,
that point, it was.
yes, Volk's Gemeinschaft horror is certainly an untilled field that you found nice and ripe.
Yeah, that's a word for it. It was a bit too much.
Well, you know, and you talk about, you know, this eugenic thought and sort of racial thought being controversial. I mean, this is something I run into constantly, and I imagine you have, given what you wrote, you know, in talking about Lovecraft, right? And it's not unfair to say that there's sort of a Lovecraftian quality to these stories,
Mhm.
both with sort of, you know, looking at the racial views that Lovecraft espoused, and also the sort of, cosmic horror weirdness.
Yeah.
But the common refrain, the common argument is, man of his time, this is just what everyone believed, but that's not true. Like, like that's not the case. People, I think we have this, and we have this idea that white supremacy and sort of the scientific racism that underpins it is this sort of natural default that existed for centuries and only recently has kind of been, sort of rolled back. But it was an active ideology that had, folks espousing it and proponents, and people were trying to sell it just as much as people try to sell Dianetics, and even the science was being debunked in Lovecraft's own lifetime, and yet it was still driving policy. It was,
Well, it was, because the thing with eugenics is it is 2 steps away from genetics. It is 2 steps away from, it is two terrible and misguided steps, but nonetheless, it's very close to the notion of how one breeds animals, like simple genetics, not actually understanding the chemistry of it, but understanding the way that breeding works, that the way that evolution works, that Darwinism works.
Getting the seeds out of your bananas.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem that eugenics had was it was all of that overlaid with frankly a prejudicial notion of what was virtue and what was a survival trait, what made people strong. It always, particularly in North America and in Europe, it always came to pale-skinned, tall, blonde people.
Surprisingly enough,
as being the survival, because of course that was that was how I think the people who were proposing that kind of stuff were. That's how they saw themselves, and it comes up again and again. As we start taking a look at genetic tests for our own children, there's a bit of the same impulse in that, and not only like it. The thing that fascinated with me is it's not necessarily a bad impulse. It's not necessarily an evil notion to try and raise ourselves without disease, with strong faculties and physical strength and whatnot. It would be wonderful if everybody could be okay in terms of in terms of their health. The problem comes in trying to determine that and stop certain people from promulgating because they have a history of that.
Well, there was a fascinating book that came out a few years ago called Far from the Tree. And it was not really about parenting, but it was looking at the bizarre intersection of sort of, ability/disability and identity, and looking at, the sort of each chapter was kind of, parents of children with some, quote unquote abnormality, right? So children, parents of deaf children, parents of children with dwarfism, autism, Down syndrome, and looking at the kind of the complexity of curing these disabilities, these sort of, abnormalities, and how, you fully understand parents who want children that look and sound and act like them, but children are not, are not sort of, test tubes for us to do sort of social science in. And in some areas, there is a community, right? We talk about we have an understanding of neurodiversity now, right? This idea of, no, it's not about curing autism. It's simply about, providing structures so that people with, certain autistic elements can function well and thrive in society, It's why there's been this kind of backlash to the sort of, vaccine autism sort of link and all the sort of really dreadful autistic cures, which sometimes sound like weird eugenic, sort of cures and whatnot. And that had a profound, that book had a profound impact just on my preparing to be a father and thinking about identity. But it raised so many really, profound questions because, the genetic screening that takes place with children with Down syndrome, and, how do we approach that? Is it, the whole kind of, wrongful life lawsuits that take place where, children who cannot or not don't have a viable life outside of, medical sustained technology like parents are sort of left to sort of wrestle with this, and it's really, there's not an easy answer, and I think eugenics strove for that easy answer and strove to find a way to sort of, again, racial hygiene, ethnic hygiene, make everything about cleanliness.
Yeah,
but it's hard, and it should be hard. Life is hard.
Yeah, I think going back to your initial idea about modernity, one of the things in modernity that we have attempted to do is to figure out a way to not play the hand that was dealt us. If we live in a cold climate, we make sure that we can always have a warm and dry place. There are many good things with this. We want to step outside of our nature and be able to enjoy things. I mean, right now in modernity, you and I are talking over an internet and on devices that probably reasonably we should not be able to afford to do. We are doing this because the organizations that provide these things are finding other people to exploit in order to manufacture this stuff in an affordable way. We are making all sorts of trade-offs, and a lot of very dark trade-offs to live as well as we do, better than in nature we might deserve.
If folks want to have a hard time sleeping tonight, just look up coltan mining and enjoy.
Yeah, I mean that's and I mean, eugenics is an attempt to make it easier to. I wouldn't say to make it easier to have your family and deal with your, but it attempts to create a certainty in a world where uncertainty is actually the rule, and that's always a dangerous game to play. It's more that it's different than medicine as preemptive medicine. It's the ultimate. It's amputating a limb because it might wither, and it again, in the most hopeful way, it leads to just a terrible evil.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any particular good that could be pointed to coming out of that. Now, having written this book, how do you feel sort of, having put it out there right as we're seeing a resurgence of transnational right-wing thought, that these, both of these books have, definitely, although eugenics was pretty even-handed about being in both left-wing and right-wing sort of areas. But, when you're writing about brown shirts and writing about kind of the, the rise of these unspeakable evils, and you put the book out and oops, well, Nazis are back in the news. Does that give you a sort of make you feel a bit like a Cassandra, or, worry that your premonitions put stuff out there?
As I was writing this stuff was coming. This is not a magical Cassandra moment for me where I woke and had a vision that the guy from TV was going to be on was going to be your president, and Nazis were going to rise up. This has been happening for a long time. This has during the Obama years, it was very clear that hate groups were on the rise, that America had not gotten over the Civil War as we thought that it might have.
No.
It sure hadn't. And there has, and all through my life, there has always been an undercurrent of quiet racism that I find in certain corners as I walk through. This is nothing new. This is nothing. The one thing I had kind of hoped that this stuff would wind up being less relevant, but I didn't expect it.
Well, and we talk about this, the sort of the corridors of this sort of darkness, and you and I both lived in Toronto for the longest time, and I think Toronto now has a sort of reputation for multiculturalism. A reputation is kind of a big sort of polyglot stew. But I mean, Toronto was the sort of bastion of Protestant tyranny. For a long time. I mean, I remember, reading about the Orange Order, reading about, sort of just like how the fact that, for folks at home, Ontario has a public school system that's taxpayer based, and a Catholic school system that is also taxpayer based, and that seemed completely sort of bizarre, and like, what on earth, what did this come from, until sort of, a friend sort of took me aside and tucked my sleeve and was like, our public schools were essentially the Protestant schools.
Yeah.
And that made a lot more sense.
Well, it hadn't evolved that way. I mean, when Catholic schools were finally publicly funded at the secondary level, it was because it was also a constitutional deal. It was our I wouldn't say that our confederation was quite the same thing as your healing of the Civil War, but we had a very strong Roman Catholic population in Quebec that demanded this, and this was how we pulled it together. I remember actually covering it when full funding came up as a reporter, and the outgoing premier of the province, Bill Davis at the time, did this as his last act because he kind of knew he had to, and he was going to get killed.
Well, and this segues us nicely into your, other line of work, which is sitting right there at City Hall, writing about a very different kind of Lovecraftian horror.
Yeah, sometimes it's not, but it's getting back to that.
I was about to say, like, so telling folks that you were there during the sort of the Rob Ford maelstrom, and then sort of after that, things seemed like they were going to calm down, but nope, that was just the preview.
No, I mean, just for our viewers and listeners, we had a provincial election, which is like a state election, but not. And the premier of the country, who was ahead of who managed to take the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party after an unusual sex scandal, is Doug Ford. He's Rob Ford's brother, and he has, after taking power, because he had sat on Toronto Council and
run for mayor and
run for mayor and lost to John Tory, has decided that he is going to, in the midst of the municipal election, cut the number of councillors almost in half, and throw the election's been thrown into chaos right now. There are 47 council seats that had been up for grabs. Now it's 25. No one knows who's running where, what's going on. I can't imagine that the premier's not enjoying this.
Well, I mean, it seems to be, and from what I've seen, he didn't run much of a campaign besides we're going to, give Toronto theirs, and that seems to be all he is. He's only a real campaign promise, and he's certainly following through on it.
I'm not even sure he promised that. He didn't really promise much.
Buck a beer.
He was going. Oh yes, $1 a beer. He did promise an expensive beer, and marijuana is going to be legal in Canada in October, and the previous government had planned to have government stores selling it in a very controlled way. They're not going to do that now. They're just going to let people sell it.
Oh, okay. Well,
so that's there is a bread and circus narrative that's kind of emerging, but we'll see where it goes.
Well, it gives you a certain amount of. While there's a free press, it gives you a certain amount of job security. People desperate to know what the state of the city is going to be like.
Indeed, yeah.
But of course, we touched briefly on my administration and here in this country, and that's also had impacts. Being a journalist, being someone who would attend conventions in the United States, just traveling here is no longer a real easy or safe or recommendable pastime.
Yeah. I mean, I have since your election stayed out of America. I made a decision to do that after the initial travel ban. It seemed to me that there were two things. One, that granted my ethnicity makes crossing that border under a travel ban fairly easy, but I cannot abide going across a border that somebody else can't because of the religion that they hold or the country that they're from.
No, it's that. I mean, there's a lot of things to get worked up about and to have been worked up about over the last 2 years. But I mean, when I first moved back to the United States, and I talked about this a fair amount on my when I did a sort of an episode on politics for the After Dark. But I had just seen the Canadian election, which didn't completely, but to some degree was this kind of referendum on how is Canada going to progress as this sort of multicultural destination. How are we going to deal with Muslim immigrants, Muslim Canadians, and saw the kind of really ugly, just blatantly cynical nativism struck down, and then to come to America and to see that rising up, and to see, even before he was president, Trump was managing to convince people to, speak out against accepting refugees, to speak out against, just basic tolerance, and, making it more acceptable to target folks, who 20 years ago, Republicans were clamoring, that the Clinton administration wasn't doing enough to help, Kosovo refugees and bringing in, Muslims from Eastern Europe, for until 2001, Muslim Americans were one of the highest growing groups within the Republican Party. And so to just see how that turned around and how ugly that became, especially after I just seen it in Canada get slapped down, was immensely distressing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It continues to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of people are taking a look at what's happened in your country in a very sobering way. It is amazing how quickly the clothing of civility can fall off.
Well, sure, right? Someone put it. These institutions and civility will be tolerated as long as the right people are winning.
Right.
And as soon as that was threatened, that's when the the boxing gloves went off. And yeah, so stories like yours act as cautionary tales. I don't even know what as sort of dark mirrors for us to sort of gaze into as our flesh goes wan and sallow.
Yeah, I can't say that it's good for you to be in America to be continually thinking about that stuff and engaging that stuff, but you also can't look away.
No, I mean, and that's the thing, right? They're sort of counting on that exhaustion and that cynicism to build up, so that you just get by and take care of yours, and that's and that's it, right? It's the acceptance of such a smaller, uglier world.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is anathema? I don't know. Like even cosmic horror recognizes some sense of like wonder, even in all its capital T terribleness.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things I find comforting about cosmic horror. In cosmic horror, the evil is rarely banal, and in fact, that's all evil is. That's all evil is. There's no, I can't name an act of real world evil that creates a sense of awe and wonder in the manner of the stories of Lovecraft and Langan and others.
Well, we have a live chat going on here. Some folks are very curious, probably because we've mentioned it a few times without saying what it is, but are curious about Rasputin's Bastard. This, aside from just being very large, what's it about, David?
Rasputin's Bastards is a. I wanted to call it a fantasia, but Sandra Kasturi told me I mustn't do that with any book. But I'll do it here. It's a fantasia about an imagined Russian and American remote viewing system in which psychic warriors who are able to move from their bodies and wander the world conduct espionage. The book itself takes place after the Cold War, and focuses on a group of Russian dreamwalkers, as they were called, who are scattered about the world and trying to coalesce and trying to make their way. In an offhand way, I describe it as my Gravity's Rainbow without the literary merit. It's it's a it it's a doorstop of a book that it's filled with weaving lots of interwoven stories. One of the things that I play with in it is the notion of identity and memory, because many of the characters have been either brainwashed or deceived themselves and don't really understand who they are. So everybody goes through a series of sort of shadow identities in the way of the deepest cover. And it's a great big book. It's filled with James Bondy violence and strange surreal scenes. I am very happy that I finally managed to sell that thing, because it was a big bastard to write.
Now, you've talked, about both these series having, if not necessarily, being political horror, but there's certainly politics kind of informs them. Being a journalist, do you have to have a sort of a really strict kind of blood-brain barrier between your fiction and your journalism, or do you sort of allow them to commingle freely?
Occasionally, they've intermingled. I've written, but in really a couple of short stories. I've written 2 stories in what may be a series of 3 eventually, of my mayor stories, that have been little riffs on interesting moments in mayors that I've covered. I've covered municipal politics for a very long time. The first one is barely 500 words long. It's the mayor will make a brief statement and then take questions, and that shows up in my first story collection, Monstrous Affections. The other one is a story called Knife Fight, which is the title story in my second collection, and that is based on my feelings, if not the particular activities that happened during the Rob Ford administration. It's about a mayor who holds weekly knife fights in the city hall parking garage.
I mean, it'd be popular.
It's well, they're very secret, but it goes badly. But all together, there's not more than 7,000 words of politics in my, somewhat more than that, thousands of words of fiction.
Well, of all the things I've read of yours, I want to say the line that has stuck with me more than any other was in the story you wrote for Tor, The Caretakers.
Oh yes.
It is when which is a very good, very creepy story. I'm going to share that right now in the comments. But at one point, one of these sort of spooky, scary entities informs one of her servitors that his drinking of beer is the equivalent of drinking cake. Which every time I pop open a bottle of beer, I'm like, oh, I'm drinking cake.
It's kind of like drinking cake. It's
except
no icing. No icing.
Yes. just bitter liquid cake.
Yes.
I really like Caretakers. We reviewed that on Miskatonic Musings, where other folks can find me talking about horror in a slightly different setting with my friends Sean and Charles. But Caretakers was a lot of fun. How did you come about writing that?
Well, that one I was interested in frankly, it drew from various experiences I've had, probably in politics and just in watching small group dynamics. It's a story about a group of people who work for a mysterious older woman who calls them together occasionally for meetings in dreadful hotels in flyover states, and this is a story about a meeting that has gone especially toxic. I'm glad you liked it. I know it's been interesting watching the Goodreads reviews on that. You don't usually get a lot of Goodreads reviews on short stories, but when something winds up at Tor.com, you get a full range of reader reaction. There are many people who like you showed the marvelous good taste to get with it. I think a large number of people just found the thing uncomfortable, but too much like visiting their parents. With,
well, that's the thing, right? There's so much horror in just meetings.
Yeah. Oh no, meetings are awful. they can go off into the dark nether regions like that.
Well, I mean, my absolute favorite movie, not to go back to Nazis, but my absolute favorite movie is the 2001 HBO BBC movie Conspiracy, which is all about the Wannsee Conference. And like, it's literally, I joke, it's not 12 angry men, it's 15 well-fed Nazis. And it's just like folks sitting down, going through the agenda and being like, all right, here's the Holocaust. We just need you all to sort of sign off on this, and
Is
it's
that
like
the one that's actually it's script as a transcript?
So there's a copy. So there was a saved transcript that was found, or the minutes were found. They were supposed to all be destroyed.
Right.
Okay. But one sad sack sort of kept his, and then from that the script was sort of extrapolated. So it's not like a word for word thing, but it's based on them, and you can tell because they spend half going through like very minute, like, so what's a, third degree mixed, blood law kind of conversation. People like, arguing and debating about who's like, which budget item it's going to be under and who's going to have administrative authority into, going into the Balkans. I've done, there's a stage adaptation, which I've produced 3 times because it's just, again, it's this really intense drama that's just people sitting around a boardroom table. Because as someone who is now myself in municipal politics and
yes, you know the feeling,
seeing the hills people are willing to die on, how many inches of yard space folks are willing to pull out their own knives for. I find that very chilling. I don't know if I find that fascinating as much as just sort of, horrific, just how, and very human, right? I mean, that's what it ultimately comes down to, is how human, understandable. And because it's so understandable, because it's not these sort of, monstrous demonic forces, it is that banality. It is incredibly disturbing.
Well, it's also, I think, I mean, we take a lot of our worst and best instincts and they get twisted politics. They say politics is like Washington is Hollywood for ugly people, and it might also be a boxing ring for the physically inept. You take out your aggressions that might be dealt with in a bloodier way in other times, and you do it with words and maneuvers. That's a cynical view of politics. It's actually not. I actually, as somebody who covers politics, I'm a bit more optimistic about it than that. I think that you can do great things in those awful meetings. You have to learn how to defend yourself and move through the political violence, for lack of a better word, that often goes on in these things. If you can achieve a consensus to help people in your city or your town or your country, that's the height of human achievement. That's something that it's worth getting bloodied, metaphorically or really.
Well, and that's, someone just asked, how do we combat cynicism and misanthropy being so involved in politics? In my case, the stakes are still sort of small. We're about to get a big fight over ordinances about tree removals. So we'll see how cynical and misanthropic I am in a week. But I mean, I'll tell you, being here in rural Ohio, in Trump country, I'm in a college town, so I'm in a sort of a bright electric blue dot. And surrounding red. There was just I think New York Times has been doing all these super detailed maps of like voting regions and whatnot, and we got mentioned because we're such this bizarre like 80-point spread within like a 3-mile radius. But it's seeing the level of engagement since November. I have seen folks who were not politically cynical or detached, but just we're living their own lives, who every week are going out canvassing, who are going door to door, who are getting involved with local races. I myself was inspired by sort of things to try to get involved, and seeing so many people willing to do the boring, thankless jobs that democracy depends on, and a strong, healthy democracy depends on people doing sort of boring, thankless jobs, showing up and listening as people describe why like those inches of their yard really matter, and giving them the time and the space to work that out so they don't pull guns on each other. That helps me again, but I'm still a novice to this, so come back in a week and we'll see how grizzled and terrified I am. How about for you?
That thankful stuff is, I sometimes feel that as I'm watching a council meeting go from the morning to the afternoon to the evening, that it's taking a long time. It doesn't seem like it's moving anywhere, but when you do it long enough and you start seeing the narrative that emerges from all those boring little things, it's powerful. It is the height of what we can do. You can, if you were trying to build a rocket to Mars, like Elon Musk, maybe you accomplish that one thing, but you don't necessarily make the world better. If you in government can build a consensus in your community, however large that community is, to do something that is that betters the lives of people and the aspirations of the unborn, for that matter. That's good stuff. That's you can sleep the night through after having done that. After having sent a bunch of colonists to Mars to probably die, I don't know.
Well, we'll find out.
We'll find
David,
out, yeah.
thank you so much for being on the show, for fighting with technology, to fighting with modernity, clawing your way.
Modernity, yeah.
What can folks look forward to coming out in the future?
Let's see. I don't have a lot of stuff that's coming out immediately. I do have a story coming out in an anthology called The World of Horror, which is assembled writers from countries all over the world. I was invited to represent Canada, so I've got a little story in there, and I am digging along at a new book. It is. I think it's going to be a vampire novel.
Oh,
which I never thought. I hear folks like that. So I'm going to do one that those folks who like that will hate. Hopefully, other people will like. But actually, I don't want anyone to hate it. I would like everyone to love it. But it is tentatively called Afterlife, but it's very early, and I can't talk about it much more than that. So that's I'm in that thankless, boring part of trying to get the draft out.
Well, as we noted, whether it's politics or writing, that sort of the thankless slog is very important. If folks want to follow you online or sort of follow your work, where should they go?
Okay, well, I am on Twitter. If you want to follow me as a journalist, it's pretty simple. It's at David Nickle. And my fiction Twitter feed is at by David Nickle. I try to keep them separate, so it's at by BYDAVIDNICKLE. I try to keep them separate because as you say, it's a different game. It's a different kind of church and state game. But I have a website, Devil's Exercise Yard. Just type that into Google, and that'll get you there. There's a blog that I occasionally update with, sometimes with me saying mean things about H.P. Lovecraft.
Yay! Fantastic. Well, if folks have enjoyed this show, you can follow me. You can see me impersonating H.P. Lovecraft 3 times a week over at asklovecraft.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, screaming into the void, screaming at modernity, at Lehman Kessler. You can follow Ask Lovecraft on Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook. If you like this, if you'd like to be part of these live conversations, these live chats, please join the Facebook group, the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society. And if you are particularly pleased and find that you've done very well exploiting all that modernity has to offer, you can support the show, support both shows at patreon.com/asklovecraft. But thank you all, everyone in the comments who've been asking some great questions and were willing to talk to me as I was sort of trying to fight my own technical issues. But it's absolutely wonderful. We love having this opportunity to chat both with you all at home and with wonderful guests like David. So David, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Lehman. It's been great talking to you.
It's been Nitty. All right, everyone. Have a great night. I'll see you all hopefully in about 2 weeks. Bye.